The Brandon Best Podcast. Episode 4. Neuralink Launch Event Commentary Part 1. Follow on Instagram or Twitter at The Brandon M. Best for updates, to give feedback, and to get involved in the conversation.
What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode. Today, going to be doing a little bit different of a format. Going to be trying out a commentary episode, essentially. So I'm going to be watching the Neuralink launch event. This was kind of a little press conference showcase that they had in July of last year, 2019. So yeah, I'm gonna watch the video. I've kind of brought them up multiple times throughout previous episodes, so I wanted to go through this video. I'm gonna play the audio for you guys, and then I'm just gonna be pausing it and making commentary here and there, maybe explaining some of the more maybe technical heavy points if I actually can, maybe to the layperson. So let me just get set up here with my headphones, and I'll start the video up. So right now it's just a little hype video, if you will, of people working in the office. Just looking at some EEG data, and I think Elon's going to come on stage here in a second.
Hello, everybody. So that video was not Shutterstock. That was actually Neuralink. So that's actual video from the company. So if you want to get a sense for what it's like to work at Neuralink, that video is indicative of the atmosphere of Neuralink. It's an incredibly talented team, and you're going to hear a lot from them tonight. So we're going to actually go quite into depth on what we're doing, why we're doing, how we're doing it, and I'm just incredibly impressed with the caliber of talent at Neuralink. And in fact, the main reason for doing this presentation is recruiting. So we really want to have the best talent in the world come and work at Neuralink. Anyone that's interested in trying to solve this problem, and that's actually the primary purpose for this presentation. So. Okay, so the why of Neuralink, just to go over it, is I think it's important for us to address brain-related diseases. Everyone, if you survive cancer and heart disease, the odds are that you will have some brain-related disorder. So it'll be like Alzheimer's or dementia, and
So what he's actually referring to right now is there's a slide that says why Neuralink, and there's 3 bullet points. So the first one is understand and treat brain disorders, which is usually the kind of, I don't know, medium term goal, or why a lot of these BCI companies exist that are doing more the fully invasive route, so actually doing implants. Trying to treat like neurological diseases, epilepsy, I think Alzheimer's and stuff like that. Second bullet point is preserve and enhance your own brain. So this is like cognitive enhancement, which is really like the far future goal. Kind of the thing we want to, through studying how to treat neurological diseases, understand how we can not only preserve your brain, but also enhance your cognitive abilities. So that's kind of like the actual goal of most of these companies, even though it's not necessarily the thing they're actively working on, the product or the function that their devices do off the bat, because it's still a little bit of ways off. And then the third one is create a well-aligned future. And I think this is referring to Elon's kind of idea with AI outpacing human beings and making us obsolete, and having more of a symbiotic relationship with AI, kind of a human AI hybrid. So like AI basically enhances your cognitive abilities, so most of us don't become obsolete when it comes to the job market. So this is kind of what the slide he's talking about right now.
if you don't, friends and family will for sure. I think unless we have some sort of brain-machine interface that can solve brain ailments of all kinds, whether it's an accident or congenital or any kind of brain-related disorder, or a spinal disorder, if you know somebody who's broken their neck or broken their spine, we can solve that with a chip. And this is something that I think most people don't quite understand yet. And we're going to go over in detail how this is possible. But I think there's an incredible amount we can do to solve brain disorders, damage, and all this will occur actually, I think, quite slowly. So I do want to emphasize that it's not going to be like suddenly Neuralink will have this incredible neural lace and start taking over people's brains. Okay. It will take a long time. So you'll see it coming. So getting FDA approval for implantable or devices of any kind is quite difficult, and this will be a slow process where we will gradually increase the issues that we solve until ultimately we can do a full brain-machine interface, meaning that we can ultimately. Yeah, this is going to sound pretty weird,
works too fast.
Achieve a sort of symbiosis with artificial intelligence.
There you go. That's what I mentioned.
But this is not a mandatory thing. This is a thing that you can choose to have if you want. And this is something I think that's going to be really important at a civilization level scale. So, and I've said a lot about AI over the years, but I think even in a benign AI scenario, we will be left behind. And so, and hopefully it is a benign scenario, but I think with a high bandwidth brain-machine interface, I think we can actually go along for the ride. And we can effectively have the option of merging with AI. I think this is extremely important. And if you think about your limbic system and your cortex, your limbic system is kind of your primal needs and wants, and it's like where a lot of your emotions are coming from. And then the cortex is like the thinking, planning part of your brain. And I haven't met anyone who wants to get rid of either the cortex or the limbic system. So clearly they work together well. Even though your cortex is in principle far smarter than your limbic system, everybody wants to keep the limbic system and their cortex. So hopefully we can have a tertiary layer, which is the kind of a digital superintelligence layer. And in fact, you already have this layer. So it's your phone and your laptop, and the constraint is just how well you interface, the input and output speed. So the output speed is especially slow since most people are typing with thumbs these days. So you have a very slow output speed. Your input speed is much faster due to vision, but the thing that will ultimately constrain our ability to be symbiotic with AI is bandwidth. So in the limit, after solving a bunch of brain-related diseases, there is...
So what it means by bandwidth is just how much information you can actually convey to a computer. So right now you have to use basically typing, touch. There's touchscreens now, so there's different gestures. If you want to think of maybe like a Nintendo Wii, I guess there's other kind of sensory, like wireless kind of remote stuff now. But still, if you're thinking about nuanced instructions to a computer, still the best way is typing. And I think like a generous estimation that he did is you can give a computer like 100 bits of information like a minute. I think it was a minute. That's what he said lately on JRE. And that's being generous. Whereas obviously a computer, we've been ramping up the different ways that it can convey information to us. And it's in like the terabytes now. Probably even close to maybe petabytes by the time you're hearing this. So that's what he means, opening up the bandwidth. If you can basically take your thoughts and have them complex ideas and send them right to a machine without having to try and formulate it into sentences and into the language you're trying to convey it in. It's essentially, widening the road of information between us and computers.
There is the existential, it's mitigation of the existential threat of AI, or yeah, this is the point of it. So creating a well-aligned future, that's the idea.
Composed of nearly 100 billion cells called neurons.
Okay, so this is a little bit of a kind of info video, I guess, on just how the basics of, I guess, neurology works. Just talking about neurons and probably action potentials and synapses and how they all like talk and connect to each other. So I'm going to try and actually just skip past this quick part and get to the next speaker here. Let's see. Looks like it actually talks about electrodes and whatnot, so maybe I will actually play it. And if you actually want to play this along, I'm at 8 minutes and 30 seconds into the Neuralink launch event video.
Composed of nearly 100 billion cells called neurons. Neurons come in many complex shapes, but generally they have a dendritic arbor, a cell body called a soma, and an axon. The neurons of your brain connect to form a large network through axon-dendrite junctions called synapses.
So basically the center part is the neuron. The axons are kind of like arms that reach out. If you want to think of like a center orb and then like a spider web reaching out to it. And then the synapses are where the ends, the dendrites, which are the ends of these kind of arms, these axons, basically communicate to the other dendrites at the synapse of a neighboring neuron, essentially. It's probably easier to understand if you can see the visuals, but this is just like basic neuroscience.
These connection points, neurons communicate with each other using chemical signals called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are released from the end of an axon in response to an electrical spike called an action potential. When a cell receives enough of the right kind of neurotransmitter input, a chain reaction is triggered that causes an action potential to fire, and the neuron to in turn relay messages to its own downstream synapses. Action potentials produce an electric field that spreads from the neuron and can be detected by placing electrodes nearby, allowing recording of the information represented by a neuron.
Okay, here it looks like they are bringing on the next speaker. And I believe, oh, it's Elon again.
That twice. It's so good you have to play it twice. Well, I think like a lot of people in the audience, there's a wide range of knowledge about neurons. I mean, some people view the brain as like this incredibly mystical thing that you cannot interface with the brain, and then some people are aware of deep brain stimulation, such as occurs for Parkinson's patients. So
what he's actually referring to there, brain stimulation, there's some helmets, I think, that have been developed and are kind of in testing with the military, where there's, I think, some kind of like magnetic field or whatever that is basically, I don't know if it's magnetic field or if it's actually like a small electrical pulse then sent into your brain into like a certain area, and it can actually help you like hyper focus and turn off, or I guess maybe limit the influence of your limbic system, which Elon was just referring to. So this is like something that's well known, being able to influence your, I don't know if it's behavior, but maybe cognitive ability, focus, attention, kind of memory, using brain stimulation. So this is like a known phenomenon that we can do. It's just being able to do it more and more accurately and I guess passively with an actual implant.
Trying to address the broad range of understanding. I mean, neurons, essentially, like, there's that whole idea, what if we were just a brain in a vat? This is often posed by philosophers, except we are a brain in a vat, and that vat is our skull. Everything that you perceive, feel, hear, think, it's all action potentials. It's all just, it's neural spikes. And it feels so real. It feels very real. But these are all impulses from neurons, what's called a spike. And our goal is to record from and stimulate spikes in neurons and do so in a way that is orders of magnitude more than anything that's been done to date, and safe and good enough that you can, it's not like a major operation.
So right now he just has a slide up that says basic principle, and there's 2 points. So neurons represent information in the rate, statistics, and precise timing of spikes. And then his second point is our goal is to record from and selectively stimulate as many neurons as possible across diverse brain areas. So again, being able to stimulate basically every part of your brain selectively, so really, really accurately in order to get the desired results, information, and these information in the rate statistics and precise timing of spikes. I believe that's monitoring the natural electrochemical reactions in your brain and reading the information from your brain.
It's sort of equivalent to sort of a LASIK type of thing. So where you can sort of sit down.
And now he just has a new slide that says 3 goals. And point 1 is increase by orders of magnitude the number of neurons you can read from and write to in safe, long-lasting ways. So what's really interesting about this is that we can read from neurons, but obviously we want to increase the by orders of magnitude the number of neurons. So being able to read more and more accurately. And then, but what's interesting about that is write to. So potentially taking outside communication via, computers and electronics, however they're connecting to your device, and writing information into your brain. That's where things get really crazy. And I think that's more like the far future aspect of that point. But that's kind of what's really enticing about that bullet point. The second one, at each stage, produce devices that serve critical unmet medical needs of patients. So this is basically being able to serve people these, I guess, neurological conditions that we currently can't treat in, innovative ways or to the level of recovery and I guess curing, I guess you could say, as we can today. And then the third one, make it as simple and as automated as LASIK, which is really cool. And they'll talk about more as how they plan to actually do that. So it's not like a huge procedure like getting like a knee or a hip replaced, which is pretty sweet.
Machine does its thing, and you can walk away within a few hours. And that's it. And you're not even in a hospital. So, like there's basically, in terms of key points that are worth taking away, the system that we designed in version 1 is capable of on the order of 10,000 electrodes. So each chip, which is 4 by 4 millimeters, is capable of 1,000 electrodes, or has 1,000 electrodes, and we think doing up to 10 is feasible. So this is in contrast to the best FDA-approved system, which is like a Parkinson's deep brain stimulation thing, which would have on the order of 10 electrodes. So the system, even in version 1 that we're going to unveil today, is capable of 1,000 times more electrodes than the best system out there, and they're all read and.
So that's a massive kind of mic drop point if you kind of understand um, what the current devices are out there. And I think you can even extrapolate or understand actually the magnitude of that statement just based off that simple math is the device they made and have is 1,000 times better than the latest FDA approved device out there right now. And this is from based on the number of electrodes that you can have inserted into the brain. So that's like crazy. And I think he's about to say they're both read and write, which is also critical.
And write. So this is really quite, I think, I mean, for something to be 1,000 times more than what is publicly approved is quite a big difference. And this will get better with subsequent versions. This slide may seem a little generic, because like everything's got robust electronics and algorithms at this point, but not threads. So the I feel like I'm in Transcendence. There's actually I was in Transcendence. So there's very tiny threads that are about a tenth, roughly, of the cross-sectional area of a human hair. So they're extremely tiny threads. In fact, the threads that we have, like I said, even in version 1, are about the same size as a neuron. So if you're going to go stick something in your brain, you want it to not be giant, you want it to be tiny, and to be approximately on par with the things that are already there, the neurons. So this is about the size of a neuron, each thread. And then you really need this to be done with a robot because it's very tiny and it needs to be very precise. So you don't want to pierce a blood vessel. So when so each thread, the robot looks sort of basically through a microscope and inserts each electrode specifically, bypassing any vasculature, any kind of like blood vessel, and making sure that it can be inserted without causing trauma or minimal trauma. Yeah, it's not zero, but.
So this is a super important point because that basically allows you to take out an implant if for whatever reason you don't like it, or if you need to upgrade. That's also an easy possibility without actually damaging your brain, taking things in and out. I mean, to be able to put in electrodes in between all your blood vessels into your brain is like crazy. And if you've ever seen, I think it's Body Worlds, that exhibit that goes around to different science kind of not conventions, but they're basically just facilities that are kind of like, I guess, the Telus World of Science we have here in Edmonton. Some of the, I guess, statues or models, I guess if you want to say, in Body Worlds had basically a human or some kind of animal, but it was only made up of the blood vessels, and it basically made up almost the entire shape and density of basically the organism, like the human being. You're almost entirely blood vessels for the most part. So being able to avoid all that is like really crazy. It almost looks like, if you look up a picture, it looks like someone made a mannequin completely strung of like red yarn almost.
You won't notice it. That's the important part. You won't yeah, you won't feel a thing. Yeah, anyways, obviously algorithms. So just to give you a sense of scale, this is how tiny the threads are. That is not even a big finger, that is a small finger.
So right now they're showing a picture of the threads. I want to say there's maybe 16 threads, and attached to the chip that they're all based on, which looks like, I believe it's like 4 millimeters by 4 millimeters. And then the threads are extended onto this kind of like end piece, almost looks like a piece of tape almost. And that's on someone's like little pinky finger. And it's like absolutely dwarfed by the finger just to give some sense of scale. And this is why they use a robot to do the procedure, and a human surgeon can't do it because it's on such a small scale you can't even see.
So these threads are just like I said, way smaller than hair, and there's 1,000 of them. And this is what the robot looks like. It's sort of quite.
Basically, the robot looks like, if you want to think of a sewing machine needle, but around the sewing machine needle, there's like a bunch of cameras and lights and like sensors and whatnot. That's kind of what it looks like, essentially.
Quite a complex device, but it all comes down to a very tiny, tiny point. So we want to just like, you see the robot on the left, and then the what looks like the needles for insertion next to a penny.
So they have the robot, a picture of just the needle part, and then next to a penny, and the actual tip that does the sewing on the needle is actually comparable to one of the letters or numbers on the penny. So the penny is from 2017. So the actual sewing part of the needle, the tip, is comparable to the one that's in 2017 on the penny. That's how small it is.
Penny, but in fact, the actual needle that gets inserted is way, way tinier. It's that little tiny thing at where the arrow is pointing. That's actually the size of the needle. It's about 24 microns in diameter. Extremely, extremely small. It's so small you can't really even see it in the picture with the penny. And then this is your rain on uranium. No, that's not really. That's agar. So you can get a sense for the robot doing the electrode insertion. That's a very zoomed in view. So they're all very, very tiny, and the robot is very selectively applying them very delicately. And then.
So basically right now what we're seeing is a video of, it almost looks like the surface of like a hard-boiled egg, but really, really zoomed in, and seeing the robot go and basically pluck and put each of the electrodes into the surface of this egg. It's actually agar, which I guess is maybe, looks like some kind of like gelatin, I suppose. But yeah, basically it's just doing the little insertions and just showing you how little trauma there is, and how you probably, like on the scale this is happening, you wouldn't even feel it, which is probably why you don't have to need a what's it called, anesthetic. You don't need to like go under or anything like that. They might use some maybe like numbing cream for your skin, where they go through your skin and through your skull. But yeah, it's like pretty crazy.
This is what the chip looks like. So action potentials. So each one of those represents one electrode. So there would be up to 10,000 of these lines. Yeah. So I guess like it's always difficult to say. There's going to be there's a lot more in this presentation. So in terms of things that I think are important to bear in mind, this I think has a very good purpose, which is to cure important diseases, and ultimately to help secure humanity's future as a civilization relative to AI. The threads are very tiny, and there's a lot of them, and they're very carefully placed. And the operation on a per chip basis, it involves just a 2 millimeter incision, which is dilated to 8 millimeters, and then the chip is placed through that, and then it goes back to being 2 millimeters, and you can basically glue it shut. You don't even need a stitch. So, and then the interface to the chip is wireless. So you have no wires poking out of your head. Very, very important. So it's basically Bluetooth to your phone. Because we'll have to watch the App Store updates for that one. Make sure we don't have a driver issue. Updating. But the key is, like, this is something that is going to be not stressful. Our goal is not stressful to put in. Should work well, hopefully. We'll check it out very carefully before it becomes obviously FDA approved. And it's wireless. So this I think has tremendous potential, and we hope to have this aspirationally in a human patient before the end of next year. So this is not far. And then, as I mentioned earlier, this is the main purpose of this presentation is.
And I think to keep in mind when he says to have in a human patient by the end of next year, I believe he's referring to when you're doing FDA human trials, not necessarily that someone's going to be able to buy it and use it, because I think they basically guinea pig with people who are maybe, I don't know, terminally ill. Maybe when it comes to implants, I know with pharmaceuticals, you can just go to a testing facility and sign up and sign a waiver, and they actually pay you to try certain drugs. So that's what he means when they want to have it in a human patient by the end of next year, which is the end of 2020. But I think recently he just said that because of COVID, it's probably pushed back to sometime early 2021, mid 2021.
Is recruiting, and we need very talented people in all these areas. So it's a lot of very talented people are needed to make this.
So just to kind of put into perspective, like, how interdisciplinary this is, they've listed a bunch of areas where they're hiring, they need people. So we got robotics, materials, electrochemistry, didn't even know that was a thing, microfabrication, histology, I have no idea what that is, mixed signal chip design, optics, neurosurgery, metallurgy, biochemistry, machining, firmware, software, neuroscience, applied math, software security, FDA regulatory, veterinary. I have no idea what that is. Infrastructure, that's kind of broad, and clinical research. So there's, yeah, a ton of skills that they need, and like basically people to collaborate to make this thing happen. So pretty crazy.
Ultimately successful. And then, speaking of talented people, let me hand it over to Max. Yeah.
I need the clicker. The present. Thank you. Thank you. I'm Max Hodak. I'm the president of Neuralink. I remember a couple years ago when we started talking about the idea of Neuralink and that there might be a company and whether this was even a good idea. I remember my first reaction was that I wasn't sure that this actually was a good idea, that the technology was there yet. And I think Elon has this incredible optimism where he'll pierce through these imagined constraints and show you that really a lot more is possible than you really think is today. And you have to be very careful telling him that something's impossible. It better be limited by a law of physics, or you're going to end up looking stupid. And so I've wanting to build a neural interface has really been like a central goal of my life for basically as long as I can remember. I think, like, we talk about AI being potentially the last invention that we have. I think that a high bandwidth BMI might be like really the first invention in many ways of like the next chapter of us. It's just really, like, as Elon alluded to earlier, everything about your experience, your thoughts, your memories, it's all in your brain and represented in the firing statistics of action potentials. So All right, so just what is a BMI? And we'll go through this fairly quickly, I think. So you start with hopefully a brain and a machine. But the machine is just a stand-in for the outside world. It could be another brain. It's all.
So right now, I think it's Max Kodak. I can't remember his name now, actually. But he has a slide that basically shows this little diagram, and it has a human brain and an arrow going from that to neural signal interpretation. So I think this is what these are what they call it, a BMI, brain machine interface. Some people like myself call it BCI, brain computer interface. But anyway, it goes neural signal interpretation, so reading the biosignals and then interpreting what they mean, and then having some kind of feedback to the brain. It can go directly from the interpretation and then feedback to the brain. So remember, the electrodes are read and write, or it can go from interpretation to the outside world. So this is the computer reads it and interprets it, and then maybe it sends some information to a server, or you're communicating to like a robotic limb or something like that. And then something happens in the outside world. And then from the outside world as well, new sensory information can come in. So yeah, again, read and write. So maybe the server or whatever you're connected to is sending information back to the BCI or BMI, and then it's doing feedback to the brain. So this is going to be really weird because it's essentially opening up a new type of, I guess, sensation, a new type of sense, like a sixth sense almost, that people have an experience for receiving information, if you want to think about it telepathically, it's kind of akin to
Software. It could be a robotic arm, but you want to receive energy from that world and impart through the senses like vision and audition, and impart energy back into the world through things like motor control. And that language that they use to communicate, putting aside the interface hardware for a second, it's very important to understand what that is, because people ask, like, oh, can I talk to my dog, or can I do these things? But it's important to understand what that language is. And that language, in the most general sense, is information. To a first approximation, everything is information. But we just consider here the information represented in neurons. And so consider two like toy neurons. One, so these lines are imagined action potentials. And so imagine a neuron that fires very regularly, like a metronome. Like, this doesn't tell us anything. There's no information conveyed in this signal. We don't learn anything from it. On the opposite end of the spectrum, imagine a neuron that fires completely randomly. This also doesn't tell us anything. This also doesn't carry any information. Now, we know that these two degenerate cases are not what neurons do, because if you fit a model from recorded neural activity to behavior of things like a cursor of a patient or a subject that's implanted, and you correlate these, then you can build a graph that looks like this. And this is a figure from a classic paper in this field, from like the academic heritage of this field from 2003. I think that actually some of the authors of this paper are in the audience today. And you can see it's the x-axis is number of neurons, and the r is the goodness of fit. And you can see that as you add neurons, the quality of the model improves. This tells us that neurons and their spike trains carry information about things.
So essentially what he's saying is that the more neurons you're taking into account, I believe, the more accurate the model becomes. It's kind of like doing any kind of statistical prediction. The more samples you have to train, if we're thinking about machine learning, the more training data you have, the better and better your model is going to be fitted, given that you're avoiding overfitting and using k-fold validation. Your model's going to work for when it sees new data out in the wild.
Here it asymptotes fairly quickly. That's because what they were fitting here was just 2D cursor control, which has simple dynamics. And if you have tasks that are more complicated, then you need more neurons. So the classic definition of information is a difference that makes a difference. It's just some piece of information or knowledge that tells you something. It's like a very abstract concept, but it's such, like, information theory is such a deep rabbit hole. If you haven't seen it before, the original paper, Mathematical Theory of Communication, is like, it's very readable. I highly recommend it. You'll start seeing information everywhere. It will totally change the way you view the world, because the world is information, as we've talked about before. And Understanding information also gets this question of, well, why do you have to have an implantable device? Why don't you have EEG or a wearable or an optical thing? And the answer, of course, is like, well, these are different information carriers, and what information are they carrying? And we know that, like, if you open a back issue of the Journal of Neuroscience and you want to understand how some species of bird encodes sound localization or something, you'll find a discussion of spikes. And we, as far as we know, everything that we care about is found in the statistics of spikes. So that's what we focus on. There are other things like fMRI or EEG. These are different information carriers carrying different information, which we believe is impoverished relative to spikes. I think that's the scientific consensus. And so the question for all these different things is, well, what information is found in your carrier? We focus on spikes. That means we have to be inside the brain because there's no ceiling that we're aware of on that with respect to that like grand vision of your perception, your thoughts, everything, like motor output, re-embodying lost limbs. And so why does that mean that you have to be inside the brain? So you want spikes. Well, people have studied, if you take a neuron.
So the previous slide he had showed different types of biosignals that people read. I believe ECOG is based on reading, I believe it's electrical signals based on eye movement. There's EMG, which is electrical stimulation in your muscles. So reading whether you're, if you had one on your bicep, knowing when you're going to contract or release your arm, basically before you even do it, because it's reading the signals that are going to your muscles before it actually does the action. EEG is the one for your brain activity, the electrical brain activity. I guess spikes is specifically, I guess he's going to get into it here, but I think he's referring to actual action potentials within the brain neurons, I believe. So I think it sounds like he's saying that it's the most high quality, high resolution signal that you can get. You just have to be fully embedded, have your electrodes fully embedded into the brain matter.
And you put an electrode on that specific neuron, so you have a ground truth electrical potential of that one neuron. And then you place an extracellular electrode nearby, which is what our electrodes and the Utah array and other people are like. We're not in the cell, we're near the cells. And then you measure how far away from a neuron can you be when you know what the ground truth spiking activity is, can you no longer see the spikes? And it turns out that the answer is about 60 microns, which is like 0.06. It's very small. It's a lot less than a millimeter. So you have to be firmly under the skull. Like there's no wearable that is going to get you spikes. This is a physics constraint as far as we're aware. And so now I just want to talk.
Okay, so that's why you need to be fully invasive, is there's a constraint of physics on being able to perceive and actually read the spikes from the neurons. You have to be, I believe it's 6 micrometers.
Talk about briefly that there's, like, Neuralink didn't come out of nowhere. There's a long academic heritage of research here. The cochlear implant has reached millions of patients since the 50s for deaf patients. Over 100,000 patients have received deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's and essential tremor and dystonia, and now other indications. And about 20 patients have received the Utah array, which is a little 100 electrode rigid metal silicon device. And even though it has very few channels, they've been able to do some really cool stuff with it. There's videos on YouTube of brain gate patients doing things like controlling tablet computers or even texting each other through Utah arrays just from the small number of electrodes. And so many of the people on the team at Neuralink came from this academic work. I got my start working in a lab at Duke University studying how mappings between brain and like the screen space change. So if you make it so that the joystick goes, like the cursor goes sideways when you push forward instead of up, like how does the brain change that representation? So the point is that there are lots of people that have been looking at this problem from lots of angles for decades, and we're in the greatest sense building on the shoulders of giants here. And so the question is, why not use one of those devices? Why not use a Utah array or a deep brain stimulator implanted pulse generator? And In the Utah array case, the rigid sharp metal electrodes produce a fairly strong immune response. And this doesn't end up hurting the patient, but it does mean that you lose the ability to record single spikes over some period of time, usually between 1 and a couple years. There's also a big percutaneous connector through the scalp. So you need to plug in big external electronics, and you're never really confident that the risk of infection is gone for the duration that you have the implant. Deep brain stimulators solve a very different type of problem. They are very effective for some Parkinson's patients, but they have only a couple electrodes, and they're really geared towards injecting large amounts of current, not recording single spikes. So they're really a very different, the DBS is really just a very different type of platform for a very different type of problem.
So the Utah array, essentially, it looks like you have, it almost looks like you have like your home stereo system, like surround sound. Sometimes you have those little small speakers that like hang from the ceiling. It looks like the person has that attached to the top of their head, 2 of them. So you definitely wouldn't want to walk around with that. And then the deep brain stimulation one is flush with your head, but it's like 2 rods that are fairly big that go like deep down into your brain, and that's causing a lot of trauma. So basically he's saying that neither of these are feasible technologies to kind of get this field to the next level.
So we had to go back to the drawing board and start over to build something that met the goals that Elon laid out for us. We knew, as Elon mentioned, that whatever we built, we wanted it to be completely wireless. We didn't want any connectors or wires coming through the skin. It had to be something that would last for a long period of time, not something that you'd have to take out at 2, 3, or 4 years in. It had to have practical bandwidth. So we talk about high bandwidth or ultra high bandwidth. Like, what matters is that for the task that you're after, there's practical bandwidth that allows you to effectively do that thing, whether that's cursor control or typing or robotic arm or maybe in the future vision. And it has to be usable at home. It can't be something that you go into a clinic at the hospital for 2 hours a week and under tight supervision of technicians plug you into the amplifiers and turn it on. It has to be something that you can live with. And so 2.5 years ago, we were nowhere close to any of that. This is a photo of some of the prototypes that we've gone through over that time. So we started on the far left. That's an entirely passive board that has 64 electrodes on it and connects to connectors that go to big external amplifiers. And then we added integrated electronics with our first custom chip. That's also 64 channels. And then there's a big leap to the device that Elon showed a photo of earlier. That has 3,072 electrodes in a fully implantable package with just a USB-C port coming out. And then we took a step back in channel count, because remember, we have to optimize safety, longevity, and bandwidth all together. And so in order to optimize some of those other things, we moved to an easier to manufacture system that has 1536 channels and a USB-C port. And those last 2 are the focus of the paper that we released today. And so we've learned a lot from these. We've recorded a lot of data through these. Like, these are actually used every day at Neuralink to record neural data and work with it. And they taught us a lot about the architecture that we think was the basis for our first human product that we're calling N1. And the central component of that is the N1 sensor. It's a little hermetic package. When it's fully assembled, this is missing an outer mold. It's into an 8mm diameter, 4mm tall cylinder. And each of these has 1024 electrodes, and we can stim and record through every one of those channels. Exploding it.
So to put in perspective, I think some of the best non-invasive headsets that you can buy today have like 64 channels. Maybe you can get one that's like 120, probably. That's, several hundreds of dollars to actually buy. And this one has 1024, so it's like a very, very big leap ahead compared to the non-invasive consumer ones that you can get today.
Opening it up a little bit, you can see there's the thin film, which has the threads that Elon talked about, which is the wisp going off to the side. There's a hermetic substrate, and then that gets welded later to a package that goes over top, and that's mated to our custom electronics. And we'll go into more detail. We'll have the technical leaders that work on each of these talk about these in more detail over the rest of this presentation. So yeah, this is just not to belabor the point. I know that Elon really hammered this in, but these things are very, very small. They're not. You can't manipulate these. This is one photo. This is not 2 photos joined together, and you really can't manipulate these with your hand. That part at the top is just a backing material that's surgical packaging. They're peeled off. The threads are peeled off that one at a time by the robot to place into the brain. And we had to build a surgical robot. And the first impetus for this is just you have to place these threads. You can't manipulate these threads. You need a robot. And then that grew into understanding where the blood vessels are and imaging into the tissue, and the surface of the brain moves because you're breathing and you have a heartbeat. And there's lots of complexity of dealing with this incredibly high entropy substrate. And it's not all offloaded to the robot. The robot's under the supervision of a human neurosurgeon who lays out where the threads are placed. But it would not be, the surgery is not possible without the robot. And so the N1 implant, we can place, as Elon mentioned, many of these, possibly up to 10. In one hemisphere, for our first patients, we're looking at four sensors, 3 in motor areas and 1 in a somatosensory area, which are connected via very small wires tunneled under the scalp to an inductive coil behind the ear. And that connects wirelessly through the skin to a wearable.
So basically you just showed a diagram where the main chip sits in a plate kind of behind your ear, and then the electrodes, the wires, go up the side of your head and then actually enter the skull, probably somewhere near the crown, and they all have their own little entry point essentially, where they're going through and then getting inserted into the brain matter.
Device that we call the Link, which contains a Bluetooth radio and a battery. And this is, importantly, the only battery and radio in the implant. So if you take this off, the implant shuts off. And if there's software upgrades or security issues, it's much easier to upgrade the firmware on the pod than it is to try and change the implant. It'll be controlled through an iPhone app. You won't have to go to a doctor's office and have them have an exotic programmer to configure it. And the first thing that you'll have to do is learn to use it. Like, imagine if you've never had arms, and then suddenly you have an arm, and you have to pick up a glass on the table. It's like not a cognitive task. You just, like, how do you can't think your way through that. And so it's kind of a trippy experience at the beginning where, like, patients, at first it just kind of wanders around, and then they figure out how to break the symmetry, and they learn how to control it. And that's like it's a long process. It's like learning to touch, type, or play piano. And so for the first product, we're really focusing on 3 distinct types of control. The first is giving patients the ability to control their mobile device, because we heard from over and over again from patient groups that if you have to have a caretaker around to press buttons for you, what's the point? You might as well have them do the thing. You have to get self-sufficient using the devices on your own. And then redirect the output from your phone to a keyboard or a mouse on a normal computer. It'll just show up as a Bluetooth mouse or a Bluetooth keyboard, like any keyboard or mouse that you can use on any computer. And as Elon mentioned, this is a forward-looking statement. There's a whole FDA process we have to go through. We haven't done that yet. This is like, these are aspirations. But we are working as hard as we can towards our first in-human clinical study next year. And again, these are plans, but the primary indication for that will be complete paralysis by upper cervical spinal cord injury. And we're expecting that those patients will get 4 1024 channel sensors, 1 each in primary motor cortex, supplementary motor area, and dorsal premotor cortex, which are 2 motor planning areas, and closed loop feedback into primary somatosensory cortex, which is like when you type or walk or pick up a pen, those aren't visually guided movements. Your body has all these senses of where it is in space and pressure and temperature and lots of other feedback. And we think for really high fluent control, you have to provide that back to the brain for the synthetic effectors also. And of course, fully wireless and able to use it at home. We think that there's a huge difference between something that you get to use 2 hours a week at the hospital versus something that you're living with every day and your brain is adapting to as much as the device is adapting to your brain. And so to bring up the other colleagues, this team is like, I'm incredibly lucky to get to work with this team. We're going to go into a little bit more detail on, I think that decoupling implantation from the electrodes is incredibly important. The reason that you have these issues where things like these tungsten microwires get rejected is they're stiff and they're stiff and sharp and they tear the brain, and they have to be because they have to get into the brain. And so if you can decouple the process of getting it into the brain from what is left there, where it can be much softer and have material properties like the brain and maybe be coated in things that help the brain recognize it as itself, that's really important. And then the thin film polymer leads, the threads themselves, are really cool material science, and we'll go into more detail on that. And then we'll also talk more about the chips, and then a little bit more on just the neuroscience of how information is represented in in firing statistics in your brain. And so with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Matthew Macdougall.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there this time. I think I'm going to do this in probably 2 parts since this presentation is, I think, up into the QA. It's like 1 hour and 17. So right now we're at the 35-minute mark. Next one, they're going to get into, I guess, the neuroscience and some of the engineering and kind of electrical engineering that they did on the iterations in order to basically build their chip and probably build the robot. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next time.